This Headless Professor video is about the 21st century grading plan, also known as the multiple options grading plan. It's complicated, but it's the best way for you to get an A. One advantage is you can emphasize the components on which you do well. In other words, you can de-emphasize or don't even count the components on which you do poorly. You can even avoid doing certain components of your grade. However, the honors students will still have to do their projects. A disadvantage of this plan is that you have to keep track of your own points. Don't ask me during the semester, how am I doing? You will also have to finish the rough draft of any project you do on Google Documents by the due date for that rough draft. The basic idea is that you need 900 points for an A, 800 for a B, 700 for a C, and 600 to barely pass with a D. If you get less than 600 points, you fail. Now we have a lot of different components. Not every class will have all of these components, but the final exam can count up to 50% of your grade. A term project can count up to 50% of your grade. If you have any assigned essays, they will count up to 10% of your grade each. If you have a preliminary exam, that can count 10% of your grade. If you have a midterm exam, that will count 10% of your grade. If you have quizzes each week, we would count your 10 best of those quizzes, and together they would count 10% of your grade. If this is an online class with a discussion board posting, your 10 best discussion posts would be 10% of your grade. The next 10, another 10%, and so forth, up to 50% of your grade. Any corrections that you do of other students' work can count 10% of your grade. Let's look at some examples. Susie scored an 86 on her final exam. That's pretty good. So we'll multiply that by 5 for the maximum impact. She also did a project and she did very well. Got a 92 on her project. So we're going to multiply that times 5 for its maximum effect. So in essence, she's counting just her final exam and her project because those are the two things on which she did the best. She gets a total of 890 points for a B for the semester. Susie doesn't count any essays, quizzes, preliminary exam, midterm exam, any discussion posts, or any corrections of other students' work. Now, if she had done better on any of these components than she did on, say, the final exam, we would have counted those things and counted the final exam a little bit less. Sam scored an 86 on his final. He also did well on 3 of the essays, so we'll count each one of those. His 10 best quizzes got an 82, and he took the midterm exam. We add up these scores, and he gets 840 points for AB. Notice that Sam didn't have to count a project, 2 of his essays on which he either didn't turn them in on time or perhaps he did poorly on them. Notice we didn't count a preliminary exam or any discussion posts or any corrections of other students' work. Let's look at another example. Sydney. Sydney did very well on her project, got a 92, so we'll count that one for the maximum 50% of her grade. She did well on 30 different posts, and so we'll count the best 10, the next best 10, and the next best 10. She also did extremely well on her quizzes, so we'll count those. She did pretty good on her preliminary exam, so we'll count that. She gets a total of 909 points. That gives her an A. We didn't have to count essays or the final exam, midterm exam, the rest of the discussion posts, or any corrections of other students' work. Another example, Shirley. Now, Shirley failed the final exam. She only got a 58. So we're going to want to minimize the impact of that final exam. We're going to count as many other things as possible. She did better on each of her 5 essays. Let's count each of those. She got a 90 on her 10 best quizzes. We'll count that. Got a 75 on the midterm. Well, that's still better than the final exam. Let's count that. So because we're counting all these other things, we can minimize the final exam. It doesn't have to be half of her grade. It'll only be 30% of her grade. So she gets 764 points for a C. Shirley doesn't count a project, preliminary exam, any discussion posts, or any corrections of other students' work. Let me show you some mistakes students sometimes make in doing their calculations. Let's go back to the case of Sam. Sam might write me an email saying, wait a minute, you forgot to count one of the essays. I got a 60 on another essay that we didn't count before. Let's count that essay, and now I've got 900 points, so I get an A. No, Sam, you don't get an A. The problem is now you're counting too many things. You've made the total possible number of points 1,100 and not 1,000. So actually the percent earned would only be 900 over 1,100, which is closer to 82%, which is still just a B. Sam, if you really want to count that essay number 3 for 60 points, we're going to have to count something else less, like maybe we'll count your final exam for only 40% of your grade. So that would still get you only a B. Let's take another example that I see very frequently, the case of Simon. Simon doesn't like to do any writing. And so the only things he did all semester is he took the final, he took the midterm, and he took some quizzes. And so Simon writes me, oh, look, I got an 86 in the final, a 92 in the midterm, and I got a 94 in the 10 best quizzes. Oh, that averages out to a 90%. I get an A. No, Simon. That would mean he's counting some things too much. The midterm can only count 10% of the grade, not a third. The 10 best quizzes can only count 10% of the grade, not a third. Here's the correct calculations for Simon. He can count the final exam 5 times for 430 points, but he only gets 92 for the midterm, 94 for the 10 best quizzes. He's only earned 616 points for the semester. He's lucky to pass with a D. The best advice I can give you is get a project approved early in the semester. Stay ahead of the deadlines. Write the project on Google Documents. Finish by the rough draft deadline. Revise by the end of the semester. If you don't complete a project, then you need to have done enough essays or posts to give you enough points to earn the grade you want. Students do fail this course under the multiple options plan. And the students who fail just did not do enough writing. They tried to get out of essays, posts, and project, or just didn't do that well in their writings. You've got to do some writing to do well in this course.